Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I am the host and also the founder and CEO of SERMA, Rich Lenkov. And today we've got a great guest on a very topical issue. Going to talk to us about the latest involving name, image, and licensing deals, and also the transfer portal in college athletics. We've got from Niagara University, the Dean of the College of Hospitality, Sport, and Tourism Management, Bridget Niland. Dean, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rich. Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. So, just over the last couple of days, I've seen a lot of headlines involving both NIL and transfer portal. There's a great article on CBSSports.com discussing the exhaustion and burnout from NIL, transfer portal, and recruiting that college coaches are experiencing. I know Peloton just announced an NIL deal with Michigan Athletics. There's a UCLA star basketball player who gifted her teammates with some sleep pillows that she got through an NIL deal. So NILs are here to stay. So talk to us about what's going on lately with NILs as it relates to college athletics.
I think the big buzzwords right now are obviously the tracking of these really large gifts. I mean, in addition to the sleep pillows being awarded by that female student athlete, you also have the quarterback of Notre Dame who just signed an NIL deal with Beats by Dre, and he's gifting all of his teammates headphones, which is wonderfully generous, but it is opening up a complete compliance era that the NCAA is never known to understand. A little bit about my background is I spent really probably 5 years in Indianapolis with the NCAA, working a lot on the Division I legislative issues. But prior to that, I was part of their student representation in their management council. And back in those days, we were worried about students even being employed, even being able to hold down a part-time job on campus while they were being an NCAA Division I student athlete. And surely, 25 years later, we're talking a kind of just a compliance landscape that we've never even seen before. And I think as everyone that has followed college sports or worked in college sports, really almost beyond the reach of the NCAA to even regulate at this point. The NCAA has always focused its legislation on trying this principle of amateurism, which has been chipped away by numerous legal decisions in the past 10 to 15 years to where it's really irrelevant at your biggest programs. You have these student athletes signing multi-million-dollar deals. Student athletes, even at the smaller colleges, we have here at Niagara, we have some NIL deals that has even caused, people to say you have one student that might even be bringing $30,000 in a year. What does that look like for the other student that doesn't have anything? That's $30,000 isn't quite to the level that you can gift things to your teammates. And so, you're seeing this kind of, reverberation go throughout the entire college sports industry. Interestingly, it's kind of the perfect storm because it also happened where the NCAA was also receiving pressure on their very draconian transfer rules. So you really had probably the worst case scenario for a regulatory body in which you have legal decisions pressing you on your principle of amateurism, and you have state legislators kind of pressing you on almost like a student's rights, human rights ability to move freely within the marketplace. And both of those exploded at the same time. So you have students who can, and I think one thing you and I talked about is you have an NIL deal and you have collectives now. We'll talk about collectives in a second, but you have a student who could come to an institution, accept a collective gift, be there for a year, maybe two, and transfer. And that money that just went into that collective gift is gone, And so, if you're a big enough school and you're some of the bigger, the ones that have always made money, this is not a problem that they can't handle because, most problems can be addressed by money. But if you're slightly off that echelon, it's really causing even further division in resources between your well-situated schools and your non-situated schools. And I'm happy to talk more specifically about that if you want to explore the impacts of that.
Yeah, there's a lot to explore there, a lot to unpack I want to discuss. But, having had the experience in Indianapolis with the NCAA for as long as you did, speak to, did they envision that these changes and, the changes in some of the laws that we've talked about and some of the case law, did they envision that it would lead to what we have today, which is, as you point out, mass transfer of students? I think a program can't really rely now year to year on the resources they'll have, even coming into the season. We saw a great example of Colorado, right? Colorado was a at best can be considered a middle of the road football program for years and years, right? Would routinely lose between, 8, 9 games a season. Then suddenly they hire Coach Prime, Deion Sanders, who had, great success in the last couple of years. And suddenly it's, he transformed the entire team. I think, probably 90% of the team is new that came into Colorado. Literally, a friend of my daughter's who's starting at Colorado this week said she can't even envision getting tickets for herself because of the waiting list that's now developed. So that seems transformational, not just for college sports, but for the universities in general.
It is transformational. It's just also, I think, indicative. And I think you've seen a number of the former or the college commissioners from the early 2000s kind of step out and say, we warned you about this. I think Mike Tranghese, I was really interesting to see Commissioner Tranghese stepped out. He was, of course, the commissioner of the Big East. And I have direct recall of a time when I sat in a management council meeting with him in the late 90s, early 2000s about some of the decisions that schools were making at that time regarding TV money. And I really think if we were to able tie everything back down to what is creating the chaos, people can say it's amateurism. People can say it's student athlete rights. Really what it comes down to is what I remember Commissioner Tranghese talking about all those years ago of the more money that we position our schools to take in, the more scrutiny they're going to be under for not compensating the student athletes who are actually fueling that project. And the more we have a hard time really defending or even saying that we're amateurism. And, of course, at that time, the Big East was considered one of the Power Five, and that is no longer the case. Obviously, that has been split. But that is also, several years later, you had this influx of TV money, which essentially broke up that contract. And you see the influx of TV money now causing the huge realignment we're seeing. It's all connected, and it all can be traced back to Colorado and a really pivot of the road. And so when all that news broke about Colorado this spring, the one thing that struck me from my time in Indianapolis, both there, so I was there as a student athlete rep for 3-4 years, then there as an employee for 5, and then as a consultant for another 10, and I was a Division II college athletics director for another 5. So, going back a lot of years, it used to be this concept of student athlete welfare. And what's really interesting is now the NCAA is really hard to justify student athlete welfare. So while there's much excitement over Coach Prime and the, impending season that we have out there in Boulder, what about all those kids that he just cut? I mean, these were young people that will not be returning, that kind of were hit out of the blue, that were treated very much like when you're cutting a farm league baseball team. You heard nothing of that. There was no outcry from the NCAA about student athlete welfare. I mean, they really couldn't. They have lost their footing to really take that, and there wasn't to take a stance on that in a really credible way. You just can't take that, which I really think is what Commissioner Tranghese was getting back to all those years ago of this road we're going down, that we're chasing all these dollars. It has implications that we can't even fathom in 1998. And I think he's correct on that. I think what he's fathoming is what we're seeing now. The collective, the transfer portal, which is causing huge exhaustion to coaches and recruiters. And here's the other thing, it's disenfranchising high school kids because you're no longer really looking at high school kids anymore. You're checking to see who's in the portal. The institution I'm at, we have, our men's basketball team almost has a new team. And, I love Coach Paulus, but is that good for an institution? And then from an athletics director standpoint, if you have new athletes on small roster teams, probably not as much in football, what does that do for coach development? How can you hold a coach kind of accountable if every year they're in a rebuilding phase because they lost half their roster to the portal and to NIL deals? Because student athletes are savvy. They're using that portal as a way to get better and leverage NIL deals. So they're going in the portal and then they're getting these better offers from schools, better financially situated. And it's like getting a job offer, right? Like, okay, to keep me here, I need X money. And so you have to scramble to find that money, often taking that money away from other donations that would have gone to the university and college. That won't hurt the big guys, but you're gonna start seeing the squeeze on the mid-majors and the historical Division I's where they just simply can't keep up.
So, Dean, you raise a lot of interesting points again, but you and I have talked about this in the past, and speaking about student athletes who are cut, and also student athletes who are navigating these relatively new and uncharted waters with these offers coming in. What resources does the NCAA provide to both the athletes that, like in Coach Prime's case, he cut, and the new athletes coming in when faced with these offers? These are complicated legal dealings that your average student athlete is not equipped to handle.
I think especially anyone who's worked with me or for me, or, I've worked for them, I think there's no secret on my standpoint that the one thing that I learned early on in my own athletic career is that student athletes are not members of the NCAA. They're not. Coaches aren't really members of the NCAA. At the core function, the NCAA is a trade association that looks out for the universities and their members. That's who pays their dues. So when you ask about what resources are available for student athletes who get pushed out from a new coach or get drawn into the portal, enticed by thinking that they were going to make someplace better. And by the way, even though the NCAA frowns upon it, schools still simply, if you want to go in the portal, that's fine, but you're going to forfeit your right to renew your financial aid scholarship. So that's a huge choice that these students make. So they put their name in the portal, and maybe they don't get picked up, and maybe their spot on their current roster is gone. Like, these are big issues for these young people. And there isn't a lot of resources to guide students through the portal process. And you can't call the NCAA as a student athlete and say, can you help me? Can you give me some guidance? The NCAA used to have public phones, and all of us in the membership services, which is now legislative services and AMA, used to work those lines. And we were able to contact directly with student athletes and give them support, which sometimes did cause some heartburn between our member schools. And there was more than a number of occasions where we would give student athletes some advice that was in their best interest, but perhaps not the best interest of the member. And we were, guided by a reminder of, remember, the member institution is so-and-so, and that's who we're serving. We're a trade association for them. The student athletes are part and parcel to that, but they don't have that concept. And I think it's a real misnomer out to even the most well-versed sports fan or college sports fan, that two critical points that there's two key actors in every college sports situation, the student athlete and the coach, and neither of whom have direct representation in the NCAA legislative process or even the conference legislative process. They don't vote. They don't have any voice. Neither of those two entities have a voice on certain topics. Playing rules, yes, coaches do. But these type of rules that we're talking about right now, they do not. And I think that's where you see the university and the dollar signs and their protection, their ability to protect their risks, Rich, really come to the forefront.
Dean, you mentioned the realignment that has gone on over the last few weeks. Last few years, but also most prominent in the last few weeks. And, a lot of our listeners and viewers might have missed some of this because it, middle of the summer, but I want to give that some context. The Pac-12 has been around in some shape or form for 108 years. In the space of a few days, it was gone. For all intents and purposes, it was gone. It was reduced to 4 teams that are sort of out there in the wilderness.
Right.
What's the correlation between what you're talking about as it relates to NILs and transfer portals and, what's happened with the Pac-12 and now the big 15, 16, whatever the Big Ten is now called? What's the relationship there?
Well, I think the relationship is money. I think obviously a lot of it is driven by the television networks who, they want to pick and choose. They really are. We're starting to see, or what's formulating is these kind of 2 mega conferences in the Southeast Conference and the Big Ten. The Big 12, I think, is making a play for that as well. But these mega conferences that have the most television worthy teams in there so that they can get the most money from the networks. And if they have the most money for the networks, that allows them to, kind of create resources to really support, probably support some counterbalance of losing NIL money to the student athletes, because that's really what's happening, right? So when you have student athletes being able to make their own deals with businesses that maybe were boosters, maybe were like that, where's that money missing? So the money that used to go to the university for the connection to those athletes, well, those athletes can now deal directly on their own. So that's going to be money that doesn't necessarily have to go into the institution. So there is some of that, just kind of building up your resources. I'm more steeped now in the world of higher ed. Outside of your elite institutions, every other institution, even your strong flagship universities, are feeling the pinch of the cost of running a university. So there's no president around that would turn down a more lucrative television deal. But they do have consequences. So chasing that money and creating these mega conferences is either further exacerbating people leaving. So now, okay, I want a better deal, either just a better, well-situated athletics program with more money. I'm going to be looking to get to some of those conferences, those conferences with those bigger schools. So, I mean, it does come down. I mean, it's always about the television money. When I teach intro to sport management here at Niagara, or the law, I teach over at the University of Buffalo Law School. I would say if you're ever in doubt of a question and you have to guess, just say it's about TV money. Because essentially you would probably get partial credit, because when we're talking about the regulation of college sports or its organizational governance structure, it typically comes down to TV money, how it drives it. The transfer portal the transfer portal on NIL now kind of let the student athletes play in that game that's been going on for the past 20 years, because they have cachet and they can take their name, their image, their likeness, and their endorsement deals to other schools.
To the extent that some of the issues that you're talking about will continue to have negative impacts on athletes in some respects, some athletes for sure, and on college athletics and universities in general, there's generally two ways to try to remedy that, right? Legislation and litigation. I know that there is legislation pending from 3 senators, among them Cory Booker, I believe, Richard Blumenthal, that deals with NILs. Do you anticipate, what do you foresee there? And what do you foresee in terms of any litigation arising from this new world we're living in?
So I think obviously the hiring of Charlie Baker as the NCAA president was a definite nod to how badly the NCAA as a regulatory body, as a trade association, needs some sort of solution to keep their organization alive from the federal government. Obviously Governor Baker, coming out of Massachusetts, has the connections he needs and that the NCAA needs to try to see that. The worst possible time. We're a divided country on so many different issues, including college sports, and college sports spills over into states' rights. So what you have is the Booker and Blumenthal that is a little bit more student athlete friendly, leaning to the student athletes. You could probably chart where that's popular, and it would probably chart along the same lines as our red and blue, and then you have some stuff coming out from Senator Tuberville, and that's more leaning towards institutions and businesses. And so that's where we are. We have welcomed to where even college sports becomes red and blue. So I think, I haven't heard anyone say that they're cautiously optimistic that that's going to be, that those are typically words of well, I see a path forward and we might be able to get there. You'll hear legislators or lawyers say, I'm cautiously optimistic that a solution is at hand. I haven't, maybe it's out there, but I haven't seen anyone even get to the point where they're saying, I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to get support from the federal government on this. So, I think that it's going to then be left to individual states, and you can see Missouri just passed more NIL friendly language to universities and student athletes. It's just some student athletes. That's the struggle with all of this. Even when we go back to conference realignment, and even those 3 bills that we have pending in Congress, they're only friendly towards some student athletes. We're kind of really just really positioning your high level professional student athletes in our revenue sports. And that's what you're seeing with this conference alignment. So, how student athlete friendly is it going to be for student athletes from UCLA and USC to be out on the East Coast during the week competing in soccer? So that's where these bills only address part of the problem. So that's legislatively, we'll see. We haven't seen the activity we wanted to see at the federal level. We've seen a lot of activity at the state level, which brings up litigation. So the states have moved ahead. The NCAA doesn't like to see what they're seeing from the states. So they were as bold enough in June to somehow insinuate that the NCAA rules could trump state law, which that's where you're going to see litigation. The minute the NCAA tries to take a bold move, there's going to be litigation either towards the state or the NCAA by the university saying, that there's a problem with the contracts, that they're violating or tampering with contracts, either entity. Either the state legislation is going to, complying with state legislation, which my state, New York, is one of those states that says clearly, New York state law would trump any other type of organization. So does Syracuse listen to the state and then get in trouble with the NCAA? And so there's going to be lawsuits over that if really either group moves forward. So unless there is a federal solution, you're going to see litigation if any entity starts coming out and pressing for one scenario over the other. So where does that leave us? It doesn't really leave us in any other situation than we were a year ago, with an NIL, a portal, and conference realignment, creating just a really quizzical scenario for any college administrator to try to be figuring out.
Niagara University Dean of the College of Hospitality, Sport, and Tourism Management, Bridget Niland, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed on the NIL and transfer portal news. Please come back and keep us updated, and good luck to the Purple Eagles this year.
Thank you so much, Rich.